Okay, we're taking the next big step in our relationship and we're moving in together, right? We're going to talk about cohabitation. And cohabitation is one of these societal phenomenons that occurs. There's a great deal of people that live together before they get married, or they're just living together as part of their long-term relationship. But we don't really discuss it in a way. It's certainly not recognized as like a formal step in our relationship processes, I guess. Some people kind of refer to it as, that's something that they believe people should do. They should live together, to try and test out before they get married, how their relationship like sustains itself as a couple that's living together. But it's an interesting phenomenon. This week I have you for your discussion board brainstorm like the pros and cons. Like if you were going to move in together with someone, like what would the pros be and what would the cons be? And I want you to pay attention when you get through it to see what those pros and cons have in common, because it can kind of be uncanny. That again, what I have you doing as a discussion board is something that I've had my in-person classes do together as a group. They brainstorm together. And so there's been some really interesting revelations of the parallels between those two lists. And so I will be interested to see what you find as you are writing your list of pro and cons. This week's reading is kind of unconventional. I explain in the note this week. This is actually a book that I read in my undergraduate classes. It was Politics of Sexualities, and it's coming from the reading this week is scanned in from this larger book. So it's Laura Kipnis Is Against Love. And you can see in that red circle, I mean, the O of love, that red O of love, that it says a polemic inside. And so I don't know how well you can see it depending on what screen you're looking at this on. A polemic is a rant. And so basically what Laura Kipnis is doing, I can't remember how long the book is, like 250 pages or so. For 250 or so pages, she is just going on and on, destroying every aspect of romantic relationships. Like she's challenging all of it, as you can see in the list that you read. It's an intense, like rapid fire list of all the things that you can't do and have to think about and have to negotiate in a relationship. So it's not necessarily specifically about living together, but it's about that time in a relationship. Although many of the things she lists are things that come from living together, but all of those different things that need to be worked through in some way. And I think it's interesting as the part that I have you read wraps up, I believe it says like the operative word is can't. I'm going off of that from memory. And so hopefully I have that relatively correct. I don't have the book in front of me. And so that idea of how when you challenge the idea, I guess, of relationships and the ways that we have norms in relationships, that it can be very, very limiting in some ways if you want to look at it that way. I don't know, I'm kind of almost twisting this around in a way that I'm getting myself confused. So I probably should just move on. But hopefully you find it interesting. This entire book really stayed with me as I have gone forward. I read it probably about 10, 12 years ago at this point, but especially that part, especially that list, I think really challenges us to think through relationships and be a critical thinker in relation to the decisions that we're making. So I am going to share with you a definition of cohabitation, and let me just tell you now, it's super romantic and very loving. So here we go. It's a tentative, non-legal co-residential union, and it does not require a lifetime commitment to stay together. So can you imagine saying to someone that you are in this relationship with, like, do you want to enter a tentative, non-legal co-residential union with me? Like, it does not require or imply a lifetime commitment to stay together. That idea right there, I mean, because that's the definition. That's the definition of cohabitation. We don't look at it that way. And so kind of need to think through people who end up living together. Do they sit down and talk this out? Do they sit down and have a pro and con list? Do they sit down maybe by themselves before making this momentous decision and have a pro and con list? Or, are they talking these things through of how, various aspects of life are going to be negotiated? There, as they have researched and watched the habits and behaviors of people in relationships, there's some like um, like work that's been done that kind of indicates that people don't really um, like actively decide to live together as much as they maybe fall into it, kind of, I don't want to say naturally, but somebody starts staying at somebody's house more than, like you increasingly are spending more time together and kind of increasingly are blending your lives. And instead of having a really purposeful conversation about it, all of a sudden it's just kind of happening in some ways. Like people just kind of stumble into cohabitating. And so thinking through for yourself, again, because this class's value really lies in the fact that you get to consistently apply critical thinking skills to these interpersonal moments in your life. Like how going forward, and maybe you have, because everybody in this class has various life experiences, various ages and stages. We have people who, are maybe just starting to date in their lives. We have people that have been married. We have people that have gone through, all different types of heart-wrenching things in relation to relationships. And so if you're a person that has this possibly in your future, depending on where you're at, like really, what are your thoughts? Like, how would you negotiate and think through with somebody this large step? The other thing I want to share with you as we start to finish up this conversation and you get to the work of this week is some cohabitation statistics that I think are pretty interesting. So the first batch is a little bit dated, but I think it still has some good information in there. So 40% of women that were interviewed in 2006 to 2010, so like I said, a few years ago at this point, cohabitated as a first union. So that means instead of their first union being a marriage, that they move out and are married to somebody, their first union outside of growing up is living with someone, not necessarily married. That's compared to 43% in 2002. So it had gone up a little bit since then. So there's a bigger jump from 1995. So 34% in 1995. I think this is also interesting too, and this is coming from the same batch of research. By age 18, 9% of women had lived together with someone. So let's think about that. 10%, almost 1 in 10 women by age 18 had lived together with somebody. By age 20, it's more than a quarter of women, just over a quarter of women. By age 25, 5 years later, it's over half of women. And then by age 30, it's kind of at this point the vast majority of women. So it's almost 3/4 of women. And so this information is coming from the National Health Statistics reports. I wanted to get some updated information, so I looked it up, and there's not too much done terribly recently, but I did find some more research to share with you. And so from a survey that I looked at, and you know what, you'll have to forgive me, I don't have the citation on this slide. And so if for some reason you do have some interest in this, because it was a longer survey about relationships, I am happy to go back and find it. If you want to send me a message on Canvas, if for some reason you were interested in more, I'm happy to share it. I'm sorry that I didn't do that here. But various questions were asked of individuals, and so the responses you can see are divided up on what's called a Likert scale. So that's like a scale of intensity in relation to the quantitative research that's being done here. And so a young couple should not live together unless they are married. So women and men, you can see the female and male responses were asked if they agree, disagree, don't care, neither agree or disagree with this statement. And so you can see a young couple should not live together, so should not. And there's pretty high levels of disagreement, if not completely strongly disagreeing. So almost a quarter of people, closing in on a quarter of people, strongly disagreed. And you can see a majority of people, for the most part, both male and female, either disagreed or strongly disagreed. The next question that I wanted to share with you, and I'm only sharing actually a couple, is that living together before marriage may help divorce. Because there's kind of this idea that it's like a trial, right? So you're trying it out, but you're not locked in by the legality of marriage. And so let's think about that for a second as you kind of take in this slide and you can see where people agree, strongly agree, disagree, and so on. Yes, you don't need to undo the legal aspects and go through a divorce if you are just living together. But when you have moved in together and combined your living space, your items, you've purchased probably new items together, and not just necessarily about the material things, but you have, probably blended your finances in some ways, and you've blended the daily aspects of your life. Yes, it's not quite as complicated to undo because it doesn't have the legal components of a marriage per se, unless you do live together. Oh, you probably know this better than I do. What is it, like 7 years, I think? Then it's considered possibly a common law marriage, and the person that you're living with has rights to, like, for instance, if you were to split up, like a division of assets. So they might have rights. Let's say you own a home and somebody moves in with you and starts, you're living together in a relationship for 9 years or so. If your relationship were to split up, that person who is living with you in your home for 9 years might have a right to part of your assets at that point. But beyond that, even if you were not married, was not a common law marriage or anything else, like the fact that you are so intensely combining and sharing a life, to undo that because you are breaking up with this person is still going to be pretty highly traumatic and pretty devastating, right? Because a lot of loss is going to be taking place in numerous ways, whether it's, a lifestyle of being in a relationship that you've become accustomed to, whether it's, the financial, this like sharing of financial resources that you maybe both are depending on, or one of you is depending on. Like there's going to be a lot to undo. And so I don't know necessarily how problematic it is to be thinking about this as like, oh, it's a trial and I can get out if it doesn't work. I would also be curious, like thinking about this, as a sociologist, a lot of times we're kind of like the perpetual 3-year-olds, why, ask questions, more. Like, I wonder how many people would admit this, because I have a lot of kind of, I guess maybe it's paranoia or something. Like I kind of have this underlying concern and or assumption that when people are asked about questions in relation to relationships, that they're not going to be entirely honest. Like they won't even admit it to themselves, so they're maybe not going to admit it to a researcher. But that's just my own thought process on like kind of being hyper aware of what people are going to be willing to share. But so after that little tangent, like if someone was asked, if their relationship ended up in a position of cohabitating and living together, and then it's kind of seemingly inevitable, although it shouldn't be, that they get married, right? I wonder how many people have doubts or worries about their relationships that are pretty significant, that, are developing or continuing to develop while somebody's living together, yet they still proceed to get married because they feel as if to undo the relationship that's being that living together is too much. And so instead of going backwards and calling off the relationship and ending the living together, they just proceed and go forward and end up getting married. I don't know. I don't have research on it, but it's just kind of something that I have hypothesized about, like thinking through. I wonder how many people end up in that situation. And maybe it's nobody. And maybe it's everybody, but that's kind of the way that sociology works, is that you want to think through what societal phenomenon might be going on, and a lot of times go out there and research it. So as I was saying, as with this slide that I've been going on and on about a bit, living together before marriage may help prevent divorce. You can see that a fair amount of people agree with this. And so it does seem as if people do feel that this is a good thing to do before getting married. And so I don't know what the answer is to that. And I don't know if you know the answer, but I really, really encourage you to think through for yourself where your thoughts be reflective, right? Where are you getting your ideas from? And especially like I'm encouraging so many of you to do in your future essays, how do you want to handle this in the future? How is this learning from this week going to shape the way that you approach your life and your relationships in the future?